today we have Tasha Kheiriddin. Tasha Kheiriddin is a few things. Tasha Kheiriddin has written books on Canadian politics. She's been a media commentator on Canadian politics. She has been connected with at least 2 think tanks at various times. And maybe most important, she's going to be teaching a course in the Max Bell MPP program in the final section, June 15th. And her complexity seminar is about partisan politics and how that interacts with the policy process. Today, Tasha is talking to us, as you can see on the slide, Partisan Politics During a Pandemic. Notice the subtitle, From Consensus to Conflict. So I don't know whether that's a range of outcomes she's going to talk about or a sequence that we begin with consensus and end with conflict. I hope it's not the latter. But without further ado, final point, please put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. Nick Salter, as always, is going to manage the questions when we get there, but please put them in the Q&A box. So without further ado, let me turn it over and thank Tasha in advance for being with us today. And Tasha, take it away.
Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks so much for everyone for joining us virtually here. I know you're out there, even though I can't see you in person. And to Chris's point, your question, Chris, the answer is actually both of what you said, not to preempt this entire talk. But partisanship is something that is present in our political systems to a varying degree, I think, all over the world, even in systems that are not considered democratic. So today I will be focusing on democracies and how they are reacting to the pandemic and managing it, and how partisanship is playing into that. Partisanship, of course, is the attachment to a political party or vehicle of politics. It can be a party, it can be a movement. Generally speaking, it's fueled by a set of beliefs, philosophy, ideology, but it leads people sometimes down some interesting paths. Partisanship at its best, I will say, is a tool for encouraging debate, encouraging exchange of ideas. Without parties in our political system, we wouldn't have the exchanges and the development of public policy that we see, the testing, holding governments to account. All those are good things. So partisanship has its role in our system. However, partisanship can also lead to negative outcomes when it is used by parties or leaders for personal advancement or gain, when it is used to create policies that are to the detriment of the population, to oppress minorities, for example. Populism is taking partisanship to its extremes in many places right now. And that is one of the issues we're grappling with in this pandemic situation. So we're going to go through, I'm going to take you on a bit of a tour of the world. We're not limiting ourselves to North America here. We're going to look at how the pandemic and partisanship are interacting in various jurisdictions. I picked a few around the world to illustrate how in different systems and also in different situations, in some cases where you had pre-existing conflict, did it get exacerbated? Did it abate? What was the outcome? So let's start. And first, we're going to look at some pre-pandemic trends just to situate us and give us some context. The first is there's a general consensus, I think, that partisanship and polarization is on the rise in many countries. We're seeing it here. We're seeing it south of the border. We're seeing it in Canada. We've seen it in the UK around the whole Brexit crisis and vote. We saw it. We've seen it in Italy. We've seen it in South America and Brazil. With Bolsonaro, we're seeing partisanship and populism really taking to the fore in many, many places. The emergence of the strong man, unfortunately not really strong woman, but strong man is the archetype we're seeing. Advancing extreme partisanship is also part of the equation. And I think it represents a desire in many people for security in a very insecure world. This is before the pandemic, already insecure. Tensions that we have seen, sort of the fault lines for partisan debate or antagonism, have really until now been things like climate change, trade, security issues, and the changing nature of security, whether it's threats from within or external threats. Cybersecurity, that is another issue, meddling in elections, the role of social media, you name it. Partisan rhetoric and debate is everywhere. And religious and ethnic minorities have often been or taken the brunt of partisan ire. That unfortunately is playing itself out in the pandemic as well, and we'll see how. The new axis between the US and China, or the intensification of tensions there, has also been an issue that pre-pandemic has been one of the biggest drivers of partisanship and alliances in various countries around the world. Repression of the media is another important one to underline, because in this pandemic situation we're in now, the media, which has been attacked by partisan factions until now for other reasons, is really coming under a lot of scrutiny at a time when it's also under a lot of pressure. The reporting of news, fake news about the pandemic, the infodemic we're told we have now, is a real problem to deal with. It's only exacerbated, I think, the partisan rhetoric against the media in many places. And finally, a concern for democracy. This is sort of writ large. All these trends have fed into the last one, and a lot of people have been saying until the pandemic hit that democracy was imperiled, and now even more so in some cases. Now, there's been a sort of timeline, when you, not to generalize completely, but when you look at countries and their response to the pandemic to date, with some outlying exceptions, and I include Canada in this timeline, by the way, we've seen a sort of a general trend in terms of partisanship and reaction. The first trend that we've seen is sort of the initial phase. There are three phases I identify. And the first phase is really where there's been a consensus that something has to be done. Cases are starting to increase in the country in question. There's public demand for some type of action. And generally speaking, in this phase, I won't necessarily call it a honeymoon, but it is a time when we have seen an abatement of partisanship with a preference that actions be taken, a reticence perhaps to criticize the government overtly. And I think we've seen that in Canada, certainly in the initial phases of the pandemic, because it is felt that might backfire. And second, it's unsure what the government is going to come out with. So I won't say let them hang themselves, but in a sense, the partisans wait to see, hold their fire to see what's actually going to come out of this. But also a coming together, which we've seen in other countries, one of which is, interestingly, India, where partisanship's actually abated. And people have decided to just come together for a period of time until the government introduces in the second phase measures to actually tackle the pandemic. The second phase is that tackling of the pandemic phase when lockdowns have been introduced. We've seen economic measures of different types of supports for business, individuals, industry have been rolling out. And that's where the cracks start to emerge. Partisan rhetoric starts to heat up. To give an example, in Canada, one of the first elements of partisan rhetoric was around the government's desire to extend its ability to spend without oversight for a year and a half, which the opposition parties and many people in the media discourse also found was excessive. That was rolled back, but that was sort of the first crack, I would say, in the veneer of nonpartisanship that prevailed until then in our own country. The third phase is one we're entering into now. And this is not to say it's the last phase, because this entire pandemic is going to play out probably over a period of years. I don't be pessimistic, but we are through probably the first phase of shutdown and reopening. So this pattern will repeat itself over and over, most probably, until either a vaccine is found or antibodies or the virus is some type of herd immunity is developed. We don't fully know. But in terms of the last phase, which is the reopening, this is really where partisanship starts to come out, because now there are things to assess. Is the government going too fast? Is it going too slow? Did it take the right actions to limit the death toll, to limit economic issues, economic downturns that are coming out of this? What are the results of its policies? And that's where you see the criticisms start to become more intense. Partisanship starts to ramp up. And this is a natural reaction because there's something to react to. So we're going to go through a number of countries and their reactions to the pandemic from a partisan perspective. And we're going to start with one which is most interesting, because you would think everyone's been talking how good things have been in South Korea until this week. Unfortunately, I have seen a resurgence in cases, but until last week, South Korea really was kind of the model in terms of flattening the curve. They took some very serious steps and limited civil liberties to a great degree. But for most of us, and I count myself in that number, in the West, we did not hear much about dissent within South Korea on these issues. Interestingly enough, South Korea was also embroiled in an election at the same time as the pandemic was playing out, and this election was held April 15th. The governing party won by a significant majority. They got 180 seats to 103 for the opposition. The government party is the Minju party. And if you look at your screen, you'll see that the Minju party which together with the Justice Party formed the government, scored very high in terms of people who were polled before this election in terms of their satisfaction with their response to the outbreak. And don't forget, South Korea, like I said, was considered a model in crushing the outbreak in its country. When you look at the opposition party, the United Future, people who support that party, they totally disagreed. 54%, almost 55%, in fact, said they did not approve of the government handling of the pandemic, which would come probably as a surprise to many of us in the West who thought that South Korea was handling this well. So even within countries where the government may have a good result in terms of the pandemic itself, partisanship doesn't totally disappear. So this is something to keep in mind, that the result does not necessarily tie into the way partisanship will play out in that country. Next on the list is India. And India is an interesting case because it had a serious polarization within it just prior to the pandemic hitting. India's politics have been polarized along religious lines, ideological lines for a very long time. But Narendra Modi, who was elected first in 2015 and then re-elected a year and a half ago, had brought in a citizenship law which would effectively strip many Muslim Indians of their citizenship. It was extremely controversial and spawned huge protests in the country. This law was enacted in December of 2019. And states actually were on lockdown for different reasons in January. Uttar Pradesh was one where people were locked down because they were protesting against the government, protesting this law. So the climate was very toxic prior to the pandemic hitting. Curiously enough, though, Modi's popularity has now increased greatly. Many leaders have seen that, by the way, but his popularity has been tied to a sense of bringing the country together. The government has enacted very similar measures to us here, clapping for frontline workers, engaging people in this sort of sense of unity and coming together. The lockdown itself is now being extended in its 50th day, which is a very long time, especially for a population where people depend on day labor to eat. India's faced incredible challenges to ensure its population does not go hungry during these lockdowns. But 59%, at least the last poll that was done by the Times of India, say they support extending the lockdown. So Modi has really done well by this. However, at the same time that the political, political partisanship has declined, you've seen a social partisanship come to the fore. Social polarization beneath the surface against the Muslim minority in India. And part of this is actually tied to the pandemic. There was a gathering at Markaz in New Delhi by a group called the Tablighi Jamaat. They are a Muslim organization. They held a gathering in March at a time when people were told not to gather. And this gathering was then linked to about 4,000 cases of COVID-19, which at the time in March represented 30% of the cases that India had at the time. And this caused a huge backlash against the Muslim population. There was even a hashtag, quite horribly, that was trending called Corona Jihad, which was tweeted about 300,000 times. It's estimated 300 million people saw it. Muslims have been attacked. They have been beaten. So unfortunately, even though politics has become less partisan at the party level, we've seen a partisanship or a polarization at the social level that is having the same effect as the political policies were having before the crisis hit. So just because you have less polarization, at the political level does not mean that socially it will resolve issues. The underlying issues of religious intolerance are still present in India, and the Muslim minority is still suffering from that. Next up is Brazil. And Brazil also has a very polarizing figure, Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, who was actually under impeachment proceedings and investigation for fraud, allegations of fraud against him and corruption. Bolsonaro, prior to this, was fighting off these allegations. After the pandemic hit, initially he had dismissed it as a hoax. He claimed it was nothing more than sniffles and that he wasn't going to get it. He'd actually never released the results of his own tests. And what you saw here was a real political revolt against him. The Brazilian Congress passed an aid package, against his wishes, basically. The partisan divide there, it's been very, very intense at the political level. It's been fueled both by the economic impact, because Brazil is really suffering because of the effects of COVID-19. And also there are mayoral elections coming up in October, which are key to Bolsonaro maintaining his hold on the country. Things have got so heated now, Bolsonaro's supporters who have taken to the streets are demanding the military take over. So this is kind of the worst case scenario, where partisanship has accelerated to a great, great degree in Brazil. Partly because, well, I would say almost completely because it is in the interest of the leader to do so. Bears a great resemblance to somebody else we're going to talk about soon. You can guess who. But unfortunately for the average Brazilian, this is impeding efforts to actually combat the pandemic, which is not obviously in their interest. Next up is Sweden. And I'm taking a look at Sweden because, again, Sweden's an outlier in terms of how it is handling the pandemic. It has become very much talked about because of this. Sweden has taken the completely different course. I think only Belarus is doing the same thing. They've decided that they are not locking down the country. They are telling people that they should social distance, they should work from home, they should take measures to wash their hands and prevent the spread of disease, but they are not forcing anyone to do so. Some businesses have been closed, but the vast majority are open. Primary schools and daycares were kept open. And this is something that you would think because there's such a debate over whether this measure is actually a good idea, that this would perhaps create a sense of partisanship. Now, Sweden is not a particularly virulently partisan country. They usually have a coalition government. And in fact, that is part of the reason that may explain why there has not been an outcry or a development of partisanship in the country, or any really passionate political opposition to this. The other reason is that you have the public health agency and not the government taking the lead. This is something that's kind of unique to Sweden, in that the government is actually deferred to the public health agency. The two individuals there, Johan Carlson and Anders Tegnell, who've been interviewed multiple times now about this and maintain they're doing the right thing, they were the ones who took the lead in determining what Sweden would do. And their advice is called the tune. So in a sense, the government has offloaded responsibility in some way to them. And it's an experiment. We will see what happens with regard to Sweden. But there, the impact has been the most severe in communities that also are not as politically engaged. Seniors, which is a sort of universal issue around the world, but also migrants. Migrants are the ones who are suffering the most in Sweden, apart from seniors in old age homes, from COVID-19. They are not as politically engaged, and therefore their input into development of partisanship and development of partisan politics around this would be lesser. So Sweden is not experiencing any serious challenges from within. There are some scientists who are dissident. There are some voices, epidemiologists and others who oppose the policies. But generally speaking, Swedes have a high level of trust in their institutions and a culture of consensus. And so for them, partisanship has really not been a factor in management of COVID-19. Poland, however, is another story. Here we have two fellows. We have the president of Poland and, of course, Donald Trump, because they are friends. And this is leading into our next. We're going to discuss the US after this. But the reason I put this up is because Poland is, like the United States, having an election. Well, they were supposed to have an election. The election happened with zero turnout. It's now been postponed. But like the US, they were facing a situation where there was going to be a national vote. How are they going to handle this? The government offered two options to the opposition. They said, we will let you do a mail-in ballot system, which Poland has never done. Either that, or you can give us a 2-year extension and we'll just stay as the ruling party. Neither was acceptable to the opposition. Partisanship ratcheted up immediately, accusations that the ruling party wanted to use the situation to their advantage, because the president was still holding meetings while the opposition was not able to actually campaign because public gatherings were banned. The government also took the occasion to introduce many other laws that were totally unrelated to COVID-19 that had been on the back burner. For example, restrictions on abortion were suddenly brought out for no real reason, but they saw this as a possibility that they could just take advantage of the situation. The result has been now elections have been postponed, but the climate in Poland, the political partisanship has been extremely negative in terms of dealing with the virus. The sense is that there's a lack of cooperation on the ground in efforts to combat it. So the effect of partisanship there has been very negative. which is also the case, I would say, in the next country we're looking at, the United States. Here, the climate at the beginning of the pandemic was that Donald Trump was undergoing the impeachment process. And the pandemic has, of course, shifted completely the attention away from that, but has spotlighted all sorts of other issues that were already partisan issues in the United States, being the urban-rural divide. There have been serious protests against lockdown, more so than anywhere else that I have seen anyway. And they are not based, as in India, on the fact that people don't have enough to eat. They're based on people's freedoms. It's really become a polarization between left and right on the issue of how much freedom people should have, how much government should be involved. And that is a very partisan issue. Now, curiously, the Congress did come together on economic aid legislation. They put their differences aside for this. And some observers are saying that Trump is being increasingly isolated, that more and more people more and more Republicans within the party are saying that they cannot countenance what he is doing. Will they say it publicly? That is the question. But on the aid measures, they did come together and vote for those to take effect. And that also could be because they are facing elections in November and don't want backlash for that. But now let's take a look at some of the polling, because most of the polling that I was able to find on partisanship on this issue came from the United States. And the first I want to show you here is a couple of very interesting divides between Republicans and Democrats on what they see as a threat to the U.S. If you look here and see, and this was at the beginning, this was in March, this polling done by Pew Research, and you can see that on the issue of health, Democrats were far more fearful that COVID-19 was going to be a threat to the U.S. Republicans really not so much. It's almost 2-1 here as seeing it as a threat. On the economy, they're much closer. Republicans 62% and Democrats 77% say that it's going to be a threat. So this is something that's played out, the question of what should you prioritize, lives or the economy. It's been a constant theme in the US, and it's been exacerbated by this partisan divide. And then we get to the opinion on the media. And here the media really take a beating. If you look and see who people think is giving them false or misleading information, well, Democrats don't trust the Trump administration. Republicans don't trust the mainstream media. On social media, they're kind of all over the place. But generally speaking, you see a real divide between who is telling the truth and where that plays out. And this is, of course, incredibly important. As I mentioned, this infodemic, this constant barrage of information that is being sent out, a lot of conspiracy theories and other things are being spun, and this fuels public mistrust and fear. And this is a very serious problem when you're trying to steer a population to respect restrictions on their freedoms in a country where that is not a natural thing for them to do. This is the most startling one to me on the partisan divide over whether the U.S. should reopen. And this was taken just last week, I believe. Looking at the fine print here on my screen, it's hard for me to see. Yes, it was May 7th. So, okay, you can see here that the greatest divide is on the issue of the party saying who should reopen. 92% of Democrats say the country is not ready. It was not worth it to lose lives and reopen the country. They're saying it's not worth it because it'll mean more lives are lost. Only 35% of Democrats, or Republicans rather, agree with that statement. So a real huge partisan divide there on the direction the country should take, something that I think is the most striking of any of the countries that I saw in preparing this. Now we come home here to Canada. And here, as I mentioned, we kind of followed the pattern of the 3 phases that I outlined first. There was a really, I was actually pleasantly surprised by the lack of partisan divide over taking initial measures to get people to respect social distancing, get them to be able to work from home, have some economic supports. There was a consensus that that had to be done. Things have been kind of unraveling a bit since then. You notice the spending power controversy I alluded to was the first issue that the opposition took umbrage with. Then the next real debate came around how Parliament's going to function. And here the question was whether we should have a virtual Parliament or an in-person Parliament. The Conservatives, led by Andrew Scheer, pushed very hard for 3 sittings a week in person. The other parties did not agree with this. And in the end, they are doing Zoom like we are too. But the point is that this was a real sticking point. And held up actually the debate on other measures, economic measures, to help people, cope with this situation. So this is partisanship sometimes it often has the effect, even in non-pandemic times, of preventing action, of creating stalemates on decisions. And in this case, it was the same kind of thing. Another factor in Canada is the Conservative leadership race. The Conservative leadership race was paused. It is now resumed. But while it was paused, of course, that reduced, I think, a bit the partisan nature of the discussion around COVID-19, because there was no opportunity or no, I guess, huge desire to go out there and beat a drum against Justin Trudeau for the sake of advancing yourself. Now there is. Both Mr. O'Toole and Mr. McKay have done this. We've seen Derek Sloan attack Theresa Tam, the chief medical officer. There's been some nasty stuff across the board. And even as the virtual parliament has been sitting, Elizabeth May went on a tirade saying oil is dead and caused a furor there. A lot of nasty, acrimonious debate on Zoom as well. So partisanship has not been dampened by the medium, I guess is the message I want to send here. Just because people aren't meeting in person, they are just as unhappy with the decisions that are being made by other politicians sitting across the virtual aisle from them. Canada, of course, is exacerbated here. These tensions are exacerbated by the provincial and federal tensions, and we see that issues such as the economy of the West and its double whammy of low oil prices and COVID-19, feeling that the federal government does not have its best interests at heart. These regional tensions exacerbate the partisan divide in Canada. And in fact, worldwide, in the last 40 years, both Canada and the US have seen an increase in partisan nature of their politics. They have tracked both higher. Some countries have actually tracked lower, interestingly enough. I think Japan is one of them. But generally speaking, Canada and the US have both tracked higher, and this seems to be still the case in the pandemic we are experiencing today. So let's look at some of those attitudes at the beginning of the pandemic. Actually, not at the very beginning, but about 2 weeks in from the time we were told to stop traveling, March 30th, Angus Reid published this. People who thought COVID-19 was a threat or whether it was overblown. And it's quite striking. When you look at people who consider COVID-19 to be overblown, the only people who seem to think so by a large margin were people who had voted Conservative in the last election. Nobody else really shared that view. You see 64% of them in the third graph here say that they considered it overblown. When you look at who thinks it's serious, the Liberals come out ahead there, 38%, 27% of Conservatives think so as well. But it's a very striking difference in terms of where people come down on that issue. When you look at the approval ratings for leaders, this is interesting because even though partisanship has increased in certain aspects, other things have not. Some leaders who, before the pandemic hit, caused great partisan reaction, I'm thinking particularly of Doug Ford, have really turned things around for themselves, have a very high approval rating. Doug Ford, 87%. François Legault in Quebec, he was tracking pretty well before this happened. He's tracking well now, maybe less well this week. But when this poll was taken, which was May 7th, April 30th, May 7th, he was doing very well. John Horgan in BC, the same. And Justin Trudeau has definitely seen his stock rise during this the pandemic. So, and this is a common theme. Most leaders around the world have seen higher approval ratings, with some exceptions. For example, Bolsonaro in Brazil has gone down. But Jason Kenney, I don't know what his rating was before this poll was taken. 61% is still pretty high. Donald Trump, who thankfully is not a politician in our country, I'll say it, has 12. So we know how Canadians feel about him. In terms of voting intentions here also, which is a sign of partisan engagement in the political or electoral process, if we did have an election today, the Liberals would handily win it. They have over 40, probably about 43%, 42.7 it says here. Conservatives have pretty much flatlined, and the other parties have gone down. The Liberals seem to have taken their votes, I think, mostly from them, benefiting from, I think, a coalition of, or a sense of coalescing of center-left votes or center-left support around them for the actions they have taken. And it's not a surprise because the actions they have taken have all been consistent big government actions. In a pandemic situation like a war, you see government taking a much larger role in people's lives and the economy in general. And that is something that even in a peacetime or non-pandemic situation, most of these parties and people who support them would have favored. So where does this go from here? I wish I knew. I can speculate though. I do think there are probably three trends, and none of them that great, that will come out of this. Because, like I said, this is going to be a very long ride. We really have no idea how long. But we're through the first bump of close and reopen in that phase, and this will happen again and probably again. So I do think that the first trend we'll see is an acceleration of partisanship in countries where it currently exists or where they have elections this year. And I take the examples there, for example, Brazil and the United States. Um, Even we saw the example in Korea, in South Korea, where there was an election and people were, seemingly hostile to measures that in other countries people thought really made a lot of sense. So partisanship tends to rear its head in those situations, and I think it will just get worse. The second trend is intensification of partisanship in countries where government measures produce negative outcomes. And this we won't know, of course, until those outcomes, come along. I'm talking here, of course, about increased or very high death rates, economic dislocation. That's going to be a big one, especially in the United States, I think, probably more than anywhere else, because that is already fueling the worst outcome of partisanship, which is violence, like the protests in Michigan, where people are taking law into their own hands potentially to reopen their state. The third element, or the third future trend, is because there's going to be a reduction in trade and travel generally, in a climate like that, you will feel nationalism. Countries will turn inward. It is a natural reaction. Talk of self-sufficiency, of supply systems, agriculture, food supply, all these things, buy local, buy national, become accelerated trends. And protectionism was already on the rise in many places before this pandemic hit. This will accelerate that. That also, unfortunately, accelerates xenophobia and suspicion of other people. And that could exacerbate partisan or negative views towards minorities, whether they are visible minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities. Generally speaking, unfortunately, in situations of crisis and disaster, people look for people to blame, or people that they think maybe are less deserving of help. And we're seeing that, for example, like I said, you see that in India, where the blaming took place against the Muslim minority. That could happen as well. And that is the dark side of partisanship, as I mentioned at the beginning. The best side is when it advances solutions, which we would like to see in a crisis like COVID-19. We would like to see governments come out with policies that make the most sense, and have all politicians of different stripes contribute ideas to that to get the best out of that. But the dark side is that you see the sort of silo effect, where people only talk to people they agree with, whether on social media or in the public sphere, and you don't get any kind of consensus or coming together. You get a pulling apart. So it remains to be seen which of those will happen. You could be optimistic, it'd be great. We'll have to wait and see.